Hallo Deutschlerner, do you know how to translate this sentence into English? Bob ist. It seems like this should be pretty easy to do, but what if I told you that you could translate this one German sentence into any of these three English sentences? Bob eats, Bob is eating, and Bob has been eating are all correct translations for this one super simple German sentence. Why? What is going on here? Surely this is just one weird example, right? What about this past tense version of the same sentence? How would you translate this? Bob hat gegessen. Wrong again. It could actually be any of these three options this time. Bob has eaten, or Bob ate, or Bob was eating. It seems pretty obvious that since there are 6 tenses in German and 12 in English, that there are going to be more than one way to translate something from German into English. But it isn't just the one direction that's the problem. How would you translate this? Bob ate. Wrong again. You could say either Bob aß or Bob hat gegessen. For those of you who have been following this channel for a while, you may remember that last year I made a video about all 6 of the German tenses. Today's video is different. This time I am focusing on the translation from German to English and from English to German. The other video showcases when to use each of the German tenses and how to form them in the most basic way. I would recommend watching that video after this one, so I'll leave it linked in the description. We're going to start with the English tenses to make sure that you really understand how they work first. If I personally didn't teach this stuff on a regular basis, I wouldn't know these details or at least be able to express them in a coherent manner. Even if you are an English native speaker, I recommend watching the first half of this video just to be sure. If you're confident in your English skills and you know what all 12 tenses in English do, how to form them and when to use them, you can skip to this point over here. There are 3 interactive parts of English tenses. Those parts are the basic tense, perfect, and continuous or progressive. There are only 3 basic tenses in English. Those are past, present, and future. This is the easiest part to understand. The past is something before now, the present is now, and the future is after now. Each of these get their own dedicated tense, which are conveniently called simple tenses. An example of a simple past tense in English would be Bob ate the cookie. We know that the eating occurred before now, but not much else. An example of the simple present tense in English would be Bob eats the cookie. We know that the eating is taking place at the time of the statement, but this tense indicates a habitual or ongoing action. The frequency of the action is generally included in sentences with this tense by adding extra information, but that's technically not necessary. An example of the simple future tense in English would be Bob will eat the cookie. This tells us that the action has not yet happened, but is likely to occur after now. Once we get past these simple tenses, we can either add perfect or progressive or both to the title to make the other 9 tenses. Again, each basic tense can be combined with these elements in this way. Let's start with the idea of progressive tenses, which are also called continuous tenses. Calling these tenses continuous gives away their use. They show that the action started before the point of reference and is continuing onward. By the time of reference, I mean the basic tense, so past, present, or future. For example, past progressive. Bob was eating the cookie. The action all started before this point in the past and is continuing on, but all of it happened before now. Present progressive. Bob is eating the cookie. The action started before now and is continuing to happen now. Future progressive. Bob will be eating the cookie. The action started before this point in the future and is continuing to happen. What you'll notice about these progressive tenses is that they all use ing at the end of the verb, along with a helping verb. In these examples, the helping verb is to be, which is changed to fit each of the tenses, i.e. past, was, present, is, future, will be. When we talk about perfect tenses in English, we mean that they are describing a completed action or state of being that occurs after the action has been completed. For example, past perfect. Bob had eaten the cookie. The action is completed and that completed state of being can be seen before now. Quick side note, this tense is also called the pluperfect, which is helpful for when we get to the German version in a bit. Present perfect. Bob has eaten the cookie. The action is completed, and this result can be seen now. Future perfect. Bob will have eaten the cookie. The action is completed, but this completed result cannot be seen until after now, i.e. the future. These tenses also use a helping verb, namely to have, and the perfect version of the other verb. I used an irregular verb in this example. With regular verbs in English, the perfect tenses are formed by using the past tense of the verb, i.e. walk becomes walked. So, Bob had walked, Bob has walked, and Bob will have walked. Now that we know what progressive and perfect do in English, we can see what happens when we combine them. Past perfect progressive. Bob had been eating the cookie. The action started before our reference point in the past and continued on after that. It has since become completed, which we can see from our point of reference in the past. Notice that we have both the helping verb to have, in this case had, and the helping verb to be, in this case been, plus the ing version of the main verb. This shows us that all three parts are working together: the main tense, perfect, and progressive. Present perfect progressive. Bob has been eating the cookie. The action started before now and continued on for a period of time that, from the reference point in the sentence, is now. Future perfect progressive. Bob will have been eating the cookie. The action has not yet been completed, but at the point in the future that we're referencing, the action started before that point and is continuing onwards. Now that we have all 12 tenses in English, we can see them in a sort of timeline that shows when they are happening. Bob had been eating the cookie. Bob had eaten the cookie. Bob ate the cookie. Bob was eating the cookie. Bob has been eating the cookie. Bob has eaten the cookie. Bob eats the cookie. Bob is eating the cookie. Bob will have been eating the cookie. Bob will have eaten the cookie. Bob will eat the cookie. Bob will be eating the cookie. The three verb forms that are mentioned in the flowchart are infinitive, simple past, and perfect form. I have several videos about this pattern in German, but the same is done in English as well. The verb I used in all of my examples is irregular. It changes from the infinitive to eat, to the simple past ate, and finally to the perfect eaten. An example of a regular verb would be to walk, walked, walked. If you want to see how this works in German, watch this video over here, which is linked in the description. So this is still a German learning channel, right? So let's figure out where the German tenses fit in with all of this. Traditionally speaking, there are 6 tenses in German. Their names in German are Plusquamperfekt, Perfekt, Präteritum, Präsens, Futur 1, and Futur 2. These are the ones that you will learn if you are in a traditional German course in a school or at a university. Trying to translate the names of these tenses into English just ends up muddying the waters due to overlapping terms in both languages that don't have the same use or meaning in those languages. For the sake of your own sanity, just use the German names for the German tenses and the English names for the English tenses. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to ignore the emerging dialect and conversational changes that have been happening for a while in German with regards to a progressive tense. Things like Ich war am Arbeiten, ich bin am Arbeiten, ich werde am Arbeiten sein. These are all ways to directly translate the progressive tenses from English to German. This is not considered by many German teachers to be correct or proper German. I personally have used it in the past, and I haven't met a German native speaker yet who doesn't use it on a regular basis. German tenses do 2 things. They show whether or not the action is complete or ongoing, and they show when the action happened or will happen relative to the speaker's point of view. Contrary to popular belief, the Präsens and perfect tenses do not tell us the time of anything. This gets done by adverbs and prepositions, among other things, when we use those tenses. The other 4 tenses do tell us the time when something happens, will happen, or has happened relative to the speaker. I say all of that just to mention that the tenses in English and German don't overlap perfectly. That should be obvious since there are 6 tenses in German and 12 in English, but the differences are more complex than just the lack of progressive tenses in German. For every tense in German, there are actually several tenses that could be used to translate the sentence depending on the context in English. For this reason, I'm going to go through all 6 tenses in German and show you how one could translate that sentence into English and explain why that is. Let's start with the Präsens. In German, we simply say Bob ist in order to say one of 3 translations in English. To understand what exactly is meant, we use either context or adverbs, prepositions, or other kinds of information within the sentence to clarify. Let's break each sentence down so I can show you what I mean. Bob isst. Bob eats. While the English is very explicit in its meaning, i.e. Bob has been known on occasion to eat and will likely do so again in the future, the German is ambiguous. To avoid this, you can use the word manchmal, which means sometimes. Bob isst manchmal. Bob eats sometimes. This time, both languages are very explicit in their meanings. Neither of them say that Bob is currently engaged in the action of eating. It simply states that he has in the past and will likely do so again. By adding the frequency indicator, we can remove all of the other possible English translations. Bob isst. Bob is eating. Again, the German sentence is kind of ambiguous, but the English explicitly says that Bob is currently in the process of eating. To remove all of the other translation options, we can again add an adverb to the German sentence. This time, let's use gerade, which means right now. Bob isst gerade. Bob is eating right now. Now, neither language can be misinterpreted. Bob isst. Bob has been eating. This one is usually the one that trips up English native speakers. In English, we understand that this action started in the past and is continuing on into the present. But in German, from the sentence as it is currently written, we only know that the action is ongoing. Once more, we need to add a little something extra to make it explicit in the translation. Bob isst seit 2 Uhr. Bob has been eating since 2 o'clock. Now both are explicit in their meanings. The time at which Bob started eating is 2, and he is currently still continuing to do that same action. To recap the Präsens translations, let's look at the overview. Bob isst. Bob eats. Or Bob is eating. Or Bob has been eating. Bob isst manchmal. Bob eats sometimes. Bob isst gerade. Bob is eating right now. Bob isst seit 2 Uhr. Bob has been eating since 2 o'clock. Pop quiz, hotshot. How would you translate the following sentence? Ich fahre jeden Morgen mit dem Bus zur Schule. Ich fahre jeden Morgen mit dem Bus zur Schule. And the correct translation would be, I ride the bus to school every morning. Ich fahre jeden Morgen mit dem Bus zur Schule. How would you translate this sentence? Was liest du zur Zeit? Was liest du zur Zeit? Was liest du zur Zeit? What are you reading at the moment? Would be the correct translation. Was liest du zur Zeit? How would you translate this sentence? Wir sind schon seit 2 Stunden unterwegs. Wir sind schon seit 2 Stunden unterwegs. Wir sind schon seit 2 Stunden unterwegs. The correct translation is, we have been underway for 2 hours already. Wir sind schon seit 2 Stunden unterwegs. When someone asks me, how would you say X, Y, or Z in German, I almost always answer with, it depends. What's the context? I'm sure my students hate it, but that's the thing about languages. You can't simply remove your native language and insert the other language. That's one of the reasons that I don't like those books that start inserting German words into an English text and gradually change it into a completely German text. But that's a topic for another video. For now, let's just move on to the perfect tense, or the perfect tense in German. Before I get too deep into the perfect tense, however, we do need to talk about perfect versus Präteritum. Both express events of the past, but are slightly different. The perfect tense technically expresses an action that is already complete from the reference point of now, very similar to what it does in English for the perfect. The Präteritum tense technically expresses an action that is ongoing in the past. In reality, the difference is negligible. Nowadays, the perfect tense is generally used when speaking about past events in German, and the Präteritum is used when writing or telling stories about past events. I bring this up because the translations that I chose for both the perfect and Präteritum are exactly the same. The difference again is the context and whether or not we add extra stuff to it. Once I go through the general translations, I'll give an example of how German native speakers still use the perfect and Präteritum tense to express their true meanings. Bob hat gegessen, or Bob aß. Bob has eaten, or Bob ate, or Bob was eating. The first two translations seem to be the best options for translating the perfect tense and the Präteritum tense because they mirror the formation. Bob hat gegessen looks like Bob has eaten, and Bob aß looks like Bob ate. The problem with this logic is that both sentences can be used to translate both of the other sentences. Bob hat gegessen is just as much Bob ate as it is Bob has eaten, and Bob aß is just as much Bob has eaten as it is Bob ate. Let's add some extra words for context to these sentences to make them more clear. Bob hat jeden Tag einen Keks gegessen. Or, Bob aß jeden Tag einen Keks. Bob ate a cookie every day. Or, Bob was eating a cookie every day. Bob hat jeden Tag seit seinem Geburtstag einen Keks gegessen. Or, Bob aß jeden Tag seit seinem Geburtstag einen Keks. Bob has eaten a cookie every day since his birthday. So what's the difference? Well, in the one that includes seit seinem Geburtstag, we can see that the action is likely to occur again in the future, but we are still specifically talking about the past. Habitual actions in the past are expressed with the simple past tense in English, and actions that started in the past and continue onward are expressed with the progressive versions of their tenses. There are still a few instances in which you would use the Präteritum tense when speaking. Most people would use sein and haben in the Präteritum tense when speaking just to avoid the redundancy of bin gewesen and habe gehabt. Instead of saying Bob ist zu Hause gewesen or Bob hat einen Keks gehabt, you can say Bob war zu Hause and Bob hatte einen Keks. Often the modal verbs are also used in the Präteritum tense when speaking. Using haben or sein as a helping verb plus the modal plus the main verb is overly complicated. Instead of Bob hat einen Keks essen wollen, you can simply say Bob wollte einen Keks essen. There is another time when you would prefer the Präteritum over the perfect, or even the perfect over the Präteritum for that matter. The Präteritum indicates an ongoing action at the time of the story, which takes place in the past. The perfect indicates that the action is completed from the frame of reference. If the action's completedness is important, use the perfect tense. If either it does not matter that the action is completed, or you want to show that the action is ongoing from that point in the story, you would use the Präteritum tense. For example, gestern waren wir bei Bob. Aß die ganze Zeit Kekse. Bot mir einen davon an und ich habe ihn sofort gegessen. Yesterday we were at Bob's house. He was eating cookies the entire time. He offered one of them to me, and I ate it immediately. In this example, we set the time frame within the first sentence. It tells us that the entire story takes place while we were at Bob's house. During this time, he continually ate cookies. At some point, he offered me a cookie, and I ate it immediately. The eating of the cookie was completed during the time frame of being at Bob's house. If I said the entire story in the Präteritum tense, it would look like this. Gestern waren wir bei Bob. Aß die ganze Zeit Kekse. Bot mir einen davon an und ich aß ihn sofort. Yesterday we were at Bob's house. He ate cookies the entire time. He offered one of them to me, and I ate it immediately. While the English translation did not change, the connotation of the German story did. This version is a recollection of what happened. I'm just relaying a story about the things that we did at Bob's house. The fact that these events are completed is not important to the story, and therefore I did not use the perfect tense. Pop quiz, hotshot. For the following quiz, I will write a version of the sentence in the perfect tense and another in the Präteritum, as the translations for both will be the same, regardless of which one I use in each of these sentences. How would you translate the following sentences? Der Junge hat heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder gesprochen. Or, der Junge sprach heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder. Der Junge hat heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder gesprochen. Or, der Junge sprach heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder. Der Junge hat heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder gesprochen. Or, der Junge sprach heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder. There are three possible translations here. The boy spoke with his brother this morning, or the boy was speaking with his brother this morning, or the boy has spoken with his brother this morning. Der Junge hat heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder gesprochen, or der Junge sprach heute Morgen mit seinem Bruder. How would you translate this sentence? Das Mädchen hat einen Kuchen zur Party mitgebracht. Or, das Mädchen brachte einen Kuchen zur Party mit. Das Mädchen hat einen Kuchen zur Party mitgebracht. Or, das Mädchen brachte einen Kuchen zur Party mit. Das Mädchen hat einen Kuchen zur Party mitgebracht. Or, das Mädchen brachte einen Kuchen zur Party mit. This one has three options as well. The girl brought a cake to the party. Or, the girl was bringing a cake to the party. Or, the girl has brought a cake to the party. Das Mädchen hat einen Kuchen zur Party mitgebracht. Or, das Mädchen brachte einen Kuchen zur Party mit. Those are the confusing tenses. The rest are pretty easy, but there are still two translations for every one German tense, but that's simply due to the lack of progressive tenses in German. Let's start with the Futur 1. Bob wird essen. Bob will eat, or Bob will be eating, while the other tenses can eliminate the dueling English translations by adding extra information to the sentence. The future tenses can't really do this. You can add the same things that I did in the present tense, but the other translation isn't really eliminated by doing so. Bob wird irgendwann essen. Bob will eat sometime. Or Bob will be eating sometime. Bob wird 2 essen. Bob will eat at 2. Or Bob will be eating at 2. While I would likely choose the first translation in each of these examples, the second translation is no less valid. Pop quiz, hotshot! How would you translate this sentence into English? Mein Bruder wird mir eine E-Mail schreiben. Mein Bruder wird mir eine E-Mail schreiben. Mein Bruder wird mir eine E-Mail schreiben. Again, we have two options. My brother will write me an email, or my brother will be writing me an email. Mein Bruder wird mir eine E-Mail schreiben. How about this sentence? Meine Schwester wird eine Stunde studieren. Meine Schwester wird eine Stunde studieren. Meine Schwester wird eine Stunde studieren. Again, we have two options for this one. My sister will study for an hour. Or, my sister will be studying for an hour. Meine Schwester wird eine Stunde studieren. For the Futur 2, we're indicating a completed action from the reference point in the future. In English, we distinguish this even further by saying if the action is continued on for a bit before being completed. Bob wird gegessen haben. Bob will have eaten. Or, Bob will have been eating. Again, we can remove the ambiguity by adding extra words. Bob wird seit 2 Stunden gegessen haben. Bob will have been eating for 2 hours. This means that the action started at some undefined point in time, and at the point of reference in the future will have been taking place for 2 hours already. The addition of 2 hours makes this translation the only one possible in English. Bob wird früher gegessen haben. Bob will have eaten earlier. This means that the action of eating has not yet taken place, but at the reference point in the future, it has already been completed. The only way to translate this in English is with the future perfect, will have eaten. Pop quiz, hotshot. How would you translate this sentence into English? Das Kind wird sich an seine Hausaufgaben erinnert haben. Das Kind wird sich an seine Hausaufgaben erinnert haben. Das Kind wird sich an seine Hausaufgaben erinnert haben. This time we have two options again. The first one is more likely than the second. The child will have remembered his homework. Or, the child will have been remembering his homework. Das Kind wird sich an seine Hausaufgaben erinnert haben. How about this sentence? Der Hund wird den ganzen Tag auf dem Sofa gelegen haben. Der Hund wird den ganzen Tag auf dem Sofa gelegen haben. Der Hund wird den ganzen Tag auf dem Sofa gelegen haben. Again, we have two options. The dog will have laid on the sofa the entire day. Or, the dog will have been lying on the sofa the entire day. Der Hund wird den ganzen Tag auf dem Sofa gelegen haben. The only tense left brings us back to the past. The Plusquamperfekt is used to show that the action is completed at the point of reference in the past. I usually explain this as a tense that shows something happened before something else happened. Both of the events were in the past, but the Plusquamperfekt happened first. Here's an example. Bob hatte gegessen. Bob had eaten. Or, Bob had been eating. Don't get confused here and say Bob had been eaten. That means something entirely different. When we add additional information, we can reduce the number of English translation options. Bob hatte seit 2 Stunden gegessen. Bob had been eating for 2 hours. Bob hatte 2 Stunden gegessen. Bob had eaten for 2 hours. Each of these again adds context to the sentence that in English we simply use the tense to express. Pop quiz, hotshot. How would you translate this sentence into English? Der Lehrer hatte den Schülern die richtigen Antworten gezeigt. Der Lehrer hatte den Schülern die richtigen Antworten gezeigt. Der Lehrer hatte den Schülern die richtigen Antworten gezeigt. This time we have two options. The teacher had shown the students the correct answers, or the teacher had been showing the students the correct answers. Der Lehrer hatte den Schülern die richtigen Antworten gezeigt. How about this sentence? Meine Oma hatte mir eine Geschichte erzählt. Meine Oma hatte mir eine Geschichte erzählt. Meine Oma hatte mir eine Geschichte erzählt. This time we have two options again. My grandma had told me a story, or my grandma had been telling me a story. Meine Oma hatte mir eine Geschichte erzählt. Now that we've talked about all 12 tenses in English and all 6 tenses in German, let's take a look at how we can pair them up when translating. Präsens, Bob isst. Simple present, Bob eats. Present progressive, Bob is eating. Present perfect progressive, Bob has been eating. Perfect, Bob hat gegessen. Simple past, Bob ate. Present perfect, Bob has eaten. Past progressive, Bob was eating. Protegatum, Bob aß. Simple past, Bob ate. Present perfect, Bob has eaten. Past progressive, Bob was eating. Plusquamperfekt, Bob hatte gegessen. Past perfect, Bob had eaten. Past perfect progressive, Bob had been eating. Futur 1, Bob wird essen. Simple future, Bob will eat. Future progressive, Bob will be eating. Futur 2, Bob wird gegessen haben. Future perfect, Bob will have eaten. Future perfect progressive, Bob will have been eating. When I showed you the tenses in English, I had a visual representation of when the tenses take place on the screen. This representation shows when an event is occurring based on the criteria described by the various tenses. The tense itself describes when it happens. This is represented by the three main colors. Perfect makes it completed, which is shown by having a decided end mark at the action with an arrow pointing to it. Progressive makes it ongoing. This is shown by the gradient boxes in each of the tenses. In German, the representation was slightly different, as the tenses really just show if the action is completed or not, and when that action occurs, will occur, or has occurred, relative to the speaker's point of view. To accommodate this issue, my last visualization attempts to combine the two previous images into one that shows not only when to use each tense, but how the tenses in each language interact. The white lines represent points at which the action is taking place, and the yellow ones show the transition from English to German. I hope this all helps more than it has confused you. I know that I've talked a lot in this video, but I think that it's the best explanation to answer the age-old question, why did you use X tense in German, but Y tense in English? I'm sure you have a ton of questions. Please leave them in the comments down below, and I will do my best to answer everyone that comes in. You can also just test your translation skills between English and German in the comments, and I will tell you what I think about it. Das ist alles für heute. Danke fürs Zuschauen. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss!